Noon heat hangs over the seal yard like a live wire. She walks in with a plain duffel and a faded uniform and no rank on her chest. Boots crunch in the sand and jeers float across the yard like hot wind. Sweetheart, someone calls, and another says, she is lost. And another says, this is not a gym. She does not answer, and she does not slow, and her face stays steady like still water. By the fence, a colonel stands with a sealed folder and a calm stare. Near the center, the head instructor waits, with arms folded and a smile that wants a short show. He calls for a volunteer to test pressure, and the loud ones shove each other forward. She steps first, and the voices trip over themselves and then go quiet. He waves her closer and tells her to tap if the pain is too much. She ties her hair tight and pulls on worn gloves and checks the strap on her boot. He drops his shoulder and reaches for her wrist to wrench it down. She lets him touch skin, and then she turns her hips and drops weight, like a door closing. Her palm folds his thumb, and her elbow draws a small circle, and his arm stacks the wrong way. A quick breath slips from his mouth, and he stops moving. She releases before harm and slides the training knife from his belt. The blade hits the sand with a bright, clean clang, and the yard freezes. Silence spreads and holds like a long-held breath. She lifts the knife by 2 fingers and says that weapons should not sit so loose. He takes it back, and his eyes are different. Now a recruit with a buzz cut calls it a trick and asks to see it again. Another with a chipped tooth tries a joke about yoga, and the laugh breaks in the middle. A woman with a neat ponytail says the uniform looks borrowed and waits for cheers that do not come. She does not speak to them. She looks at the head instructor and nods once as if to ask if the test is done. He shakes his head and calls for round 2 and steps in faster. He aims to lock her neck and throw her down. She turns under. His arm and slides to his back and hooks his stance with her heel. His center tilts and she guides him to the sand like a heavy door closing slow. The thump runs across the yard and then stops, and the air holds still. She steps away and gives him space to rise. He sits and rolls his shoulder and studies the ground as if the ground could teach. The thin kid near the back says she must have drilled that move for weeks and that a real fight is different. She glances and he looks at his boots, and the yard stays quiet. The older instructor with a scar on his cheek watches her feet and her hands and says nothing. He knows what he saw and does not need a speech. The head instructor stands and his voice is steady but lower. He tells the yard to line the sandbag row and watch a simple drill under time. She moves to the first bag and drives clean punches from the floor and not the arms. Her shoulders stay level and her breath stays even, and the bag keeps a drum-like rhythm. She shifts to knees and elbows, and then to a short sprint and a drop and a rise. No anger and no show and no wild moves, only control and clear power and patience. A count begins and then fades as the crowd forgets to count. Hold, he calls, and the yard exhales. As one, he points to the line where the first throw landed. The sand still holds the print like a small crater in the light. By the fence, the colonel does not move. He looks at the sealed folder, and then at her, and then at the folder again. She sees the crest on the folder, and she does not stare, and she does not ask. The head instructor steps close and keeps his voice low so only she can hear. He says the yard needed a jolt, and he pushed hard, and she held better than most. She answers with one word, and the word is understood. Around them, the recruits pretend to talk, yet bodies lean toward the center like iron near magnet. The yard noise returns but softer, and the angles of the faces have changed. The loud ones glance at the ground, and the fake nice ones study the sky. She sets her duffel by a thin line of shade and rolls her wrists and waits for the next call. She does not boast, and she does not explain. The proof sits in the sand and in the hush and in the eyes that will not meet hers. The head instructor raises a hand and calls hydrate and hold comments and prepare for the next block. She drinks and closes her eyes and listens to the flag and the wire and the wind. The sun keeps burning and the day is not done. And the yard knows it. Another test will come and the crowd will watch and the noise will try to rise again. But the sound that stays is the bright, clean clang from the first throw and the echo in every mind. That sound feels like a new rule and it belongs to her now. Heat dances over the base gate and the wire sings in the wind. She walks up with a thin duffel and a face that gives nothing away. The guard asks for ID like she is a stray tourist at the wrong door. She hands the card and does not shift her stance. The scanner blinks and a crest flashes bright, then fades. His voice drops and he returns the card with careful hands. "Proceed," he says, and she nods once and steps through. A jeep rolls by and a young officer leans out with a badge shine. "Wrong place," he says, and points toward the visitor center. She keeps the same steady pace and does not turn her head. "I am where I should be," she says, and he bites the inside of his cheek and drives on at the barracks. A rack of faded uniforms hangs in a strip of shade. She chooses one and rolls the sleeves and ties her hair flat. A chipped mirror shows calm eyes and a small scar near the jaw. The training yard is a round pan of sand and rubber and heat. Recruits gather in clumps and talk big with loose hands. A tall one with a buzz cut is Derek, and he laughs first and loudest. Admin is that way he calls like a tour guide with jokes. A wiry one with a chipped tooth is Mike, and he smiles as if he cares. "You could get hurt." He says, "Maybe leave while." You can. A polished woman with a perfect ponytail is Jenna, and she smiles for a camera that is not there. "Nice outfit," she says. "Did the laundry forget to charge you?" She answers none of them. She wraps her hands and starts a clean warm-up at the sandbag. Row hands land like hammers with short-range power, and the bag keeps time. Feet set and shoulders level and breath even and simple. Noise behind her fades and then returns and then fades again. An older instructor steps from the shade and watches. Her feet, not her face. A pale scar runs along his cheek like a white thread. His name is Grayson, and he measures people by how they move. He nods once to himself and stays silent. She walks the yard edge at dusk and maps each station with her eyes. Rope lane, wall, vault, sandbag row, spar, circle, and med crate by the post. She kneels and reties both boots and checks the laces for fray. In the shed, she wipes a training rifle and lays tools in a straight line. Grayson stands in the doorway and gives one small nod and leaves her to the quiet. She breathes and counts to 6 and lets the count fall away. From the barracks window, she hears Derek and Mike talking. She writes 3 short lines on a scrap of card and tucks it into her sleeve. Balance before strength. Angles before speed. Control before pride. She lies on her bunk with hands behind her head and listens to the flag rope tap the pole. She sleeps in shallow pools and wakes before dawn when the sky is gray and open. Morning arrives, with a whistle that slices the air. The head instructor stands by a board with slotted name tags and a marker. Volunteer spar on Thursday, he says. Time and rules are clear and simple. He waits for hands to rise, and no hands rise. The marker squeaks, and he writes one name on the top line. Her name sits there clean and sharp, and the yard turns to look. She did not step forward, and she did not speak. Derek laughs and says, "This will be quick." Mike says, "Maybe the board is wrong." Jenna tilts her head and says, "Brave choice," with a smile that loves mirrors. A radio crackles by the post, and clipped words ride the static. The head instructor listens and nods and pockets the unit. By the fence, the colonel stands again with the same sealed folder, T, holds it like a weight, and scans the yard with slow eyes. The wind flips a corner, and she sees the crest. Then it falls shut. She tightens her gloves and pulls her hair into a hard knot. Heat lifts like a wave from the ground, and the board still shows her name. She steps onto the sand, and the crowd opens like a door, without knowing it has opened. The week begins to lean toward Thursday, and every hour feels like a drawn bow. She knows the yard will ask for proof in front of every eye. She plans. Nothing flashy and nothing wild, only clean motion and safe control. Thursday waits and the yard waits and the hum grows stronger. Thursday rises like a wall of heat over the training yard. She wakes before the whistle and ties her hair and wraps her hands. From her sleeve, she slides the small card and reads the lines again. Balance before strength, angles before speed, control before pride. She tucks the card away and steps into the light. At the mess, she eats simple food and drinks water in calm sips. By the fence, the colonel waits with a sealed folder and a still gaze. The whistle cuts the morning and the yard gathers. At the circle of sand, the board goes on the post and her name stays on the top line. The head instructor states rules in a level voice. Clean grips, safe locks, no ego. Choose start or answer. He says answer. She says, he moves first with a reach for, her shoulder and a twist for control. She lets his hand touch cloth, then steps off the line and drops weight. His elbow folds, and his wrist meets a quiet stop and his eyes flash. She releases at once and glides back, and a hard inhale rolls through. The ring. He shoots for a leg pick and presses a forearm to her collarbone. She hooks his ankle and turns his center, a finger width, and the sweep fails. He rolls clean and stands, and a murmur crosses the yard. Do it again. Someone calls from the back. With a voice that strains for courage, Jenna pockets her phone and folds her arms. Grayson stands by the post and watches her feet and hips with steady eyes. Round 2, the head instructor says, and his voice is lower than before. He fakes high and dives low for a body lock and a quick lift. She turns her hips into his frame and drops like a door into a frame. The lift dies and she swims one arm inside to a safe wedge. Gentle pressure behind his elbow opens his hands without pain. She steps to the outside line and leads him onto his own stride. He lands on one knee and one hand and rises after a breath. The post radio crackles and white noise rides the air. The colonel takes one step forward and stops, and the folder stays closed, the so. Head instructor raises a hand and lowers it, and the circle waits. He spirals tight and reaches for the belt knife. She reads the motion in his shoulder and slides first. Her wrist brushes his wrist, and her fingers find the strap, and the knife is free. She lifts it by 2 fingers so the ring can see and lowers it to the sand like a bell. The bright, clean clang holds the yard. Still, secure your tools and protect your team, she says in a calm voice. The head instructor looks at the blade and nods with real respect. Control begins before contact and ends after release, he says, and then points to the row. She moves to the sandbags for a short form test under time. She works the bag with short hands and long breath and planted feet on his. Call. She sprints to the cone, drops to ground, rises to the wall, and clears it. Smooth. She lands soft and returns to the circle without a wobble. Loud faces tilt down and study the sand. Fake kind. Smiles fade like chalk in rain. Grayson straps the knife down the right way and sets it firm on the rack. Good, he says in a low voice and steps back to shade short. Hold, the head instructor calls, and he walks to the fence. He and the colonel speak in tight lines that waste no air. The folder opens a little, and a crest flashes like sun on steel. It closes and passes back, and the weight is clear, even from far away. The head instructor reads one page, then another, and his shoulders settle. He returns to the circle with a face that carries respect and a plan. We test again in the afternoon, he says with pairs and pressure and no noise. He points to Derek and Mike and Jenna and calls them to practice lines. Watch her feet and her hands. He says, learn how a small move changes everything. He asks her to help teach, and she gives one simple nod. The whistle blows for water and shade, and the ring breaks like a wave. She steps into a thin stripe of shadow by the shed and drinks slow. Grayson joins her and hands a leather journal with worn corners. "Write what matters and leave out what does not," he says. She opens a blank page and writes 3 words in a neat hand: balance, angles, control. She closes the cover and feels the warmth of the leather, and the day keeps moving. The afternoon waits like a drawn bow, and the yard can feel the string. Afternoon heat presses on the yard like a hand. She stands at the circle and wraps fresh tape. The head instructor calls pairs and says, "Learn today. No pride and no speeches and no show." Derek and Mike and Jenna step to the line. The yard draws close. With slow, careful steps, Grayson watches from shade and says, "Nothing yet. Hook first," she says, "and do not chase heads." Derek tries and stumbles and nearly hits the rope. "Try again," she says, with less push, more turn. Noise leaves, and a thought finally arrives. Mike steps in with a careful half-smile. "Count 6 heartbeats before you move," she says. He does, and the motion cleans like water. "Good," she says, and moves him down the line. Jenna stands with arms crossed and a small blade smile. "Show me what? You showed him?" she says, cool. Jenna tries the pivot and the soft sweep. "Better," she says, and Jenna blinks at the tone. "No praise and no insult, only fact today." Radio crackles hard at the post. The head instructor listens and his face tightens. "Training. Heat alert," he calls with clipped words. "Water, shade, buddy checks." Now he says, near the rope, a young recruit sits hard. His eyes glass and his mouth goes dry. He says he is fine and then sways. She crosses fast and kneels at his side. "With me now," she says, shade. "Now water breath slow, now stay with me now." She leads him to the shed wall. Shade. Grayson brings a cold pack and towels. The head instructor brings the med crate open. The colonel steps near, but does not crowd. She tips water in small drinks. "By count in and out," she says, "keep the rhythm." His eyes clear after a quiet long minute. "Do not thank me." She says, "Thank shade, thank water, and thank a simple plan." The yard watches with a hush like cloth. Respect moves in and sits on the rail. Derek carries bottles and passes them quiet. Mike pulls the canopy open all the way. Jenna keeps the shade line over the shoulders. The head instructor signs a form and nods. "We drill with care," he says to everyone. "Back to the circle," he says, "teach reset." She steps where the morning throw print remains. Reset begins before the grab, she says calmly, and ends after the release every time Derek grabs the shoulder and she clears gently. Mike tries a body hug and she wedges space. Jenna pushes at the collar and meets frame. Each step is small and simple and repeatable. A camera chime pops near the fence rail. A clerk raises a phone with a grin. "No cameras during safety," the instructor calls. The phone lowers fast and the grin fades. Fun waits. The colonel says, with a wire look. Clouds gather above the ridge like dark sails. A thin wind slides across the sand, cool. One drop taps and makes a dark coin. She rolls her wrists and feels the shift. Grayson steps close and speaks in a murmur. "The yard is different," now he says. "Not because they lost noise, but found weight." She nods and says, "Keep the weight well." The head instructor speaks to the circle steady. "Pride is loud," he says, "and safety quiet. We keep the quiet and we keep results." He turns to her for one. "Last round I will enter and you choose the pace. Show the stop and show the release clean." He steps forward with open guard and breath. She meets him with the same quiet shape. He hooks the wrist and she clears circle. He drags the shoulder and she folds elbow. He pauses and nods in front of all. The lesson lands deeper than the motion shown. Rain thickens and the sand turns darker. Fast. Dismiss for now. He calls water and food. Dry shirts and careful steps to barracks now. The yard breaks in calm. Lines without noise. Derek passes and says thanks without looking down. Mike says the count trick helped a lot. Jenna says one word only, and it is respect. She returns to the shed for a last task. She wipes the knife and straps it firm. The rack holds, steady like a promise kept. The colonel comes to the door and waits. He holds out the sealed folder without words. "For you," he says, and leaves it there. She takes the folder and feels the rain. Leather is cool, and the edges are sharp. She does not open it, not yet. She sets it in the duffel and ties cord. On the roof, rain begins to sing softly. Outside, the yard is dark and bright, both. The day is not finished, not by much. In the next light, the truth will move. When it comes, the base will change. Little every step will feel the shift in weight. Morning opens clean above the base, and the smell of wet sand still hangs. She wakes early and sits with the sealed folder resting in both hands. Leather feels cool and steady, and the cord leaves a faint mark across her palm. She waits a breath because waiting can be its own kind of strength. Outside, the flag snaps and small puddles shine like coins in a line. She ties her hair tight, wraps fresh tape, and slides the small card into her sleeve. Balance before strength, angles before speed, control before pride. She checks the knife rack, and the strap sits firm like a kept promise. Grayson stands in the doorway with rain on his jacket and gives one short nod. "Staying long?" he asks in a quiet tone. "Not long." She answers only until the work is done. The whistle cuts the soft morning, and the yard fills in calm steps. The head instructor enters the circle without swagger, and the crowd mirrors his stance. "Today we keep what we earned," he says, "and make it part of the body and the breath." He turns to her and asks for one last lesson so the yard can carry it forward. She nods, and the hush settles over the ring like a light coat show the hook. He says, "Show the thing that changes minds in one breath." She chooses a simple grip break and a clean release without pain or show. Derek takes her wrist with care and tries to hold. She turns 1 inch and drops a finger width of weight, and the hold empties by itself. A ripple moves through the circle like wind across tall grass. Mike steps next and counts 6 heartbeats just like she taught. She shows the wedge and the lead and the space, and his face shifts to wonder. Jenna steps with a collar push and meets bone frame and quiet angles. Her eyes widen and her mouth closes, and she gives a small nod without pride. By the fence, the colonel watches with folded hands and a still gaze. The head instructor calls a pair round to set the lesson in muscle and mind. Round by round, the recruits move through the forms like a slow song. Each grip meets a path, and each push meets a turn, and each fall meets soft sand. No one jeers, and no one plays to the crowd. They track her feet and her hips and her hands and copy the small parts. Grayson checks the rack again and taps the strap, and the click is clear as a bell. The base remembers the bright clang from the first day and holds it beside this quiet click. When the last pair ends, the head instructor lifts his hand and the yard goes still. He faces her with a voice that carries, and yet does not shout. "You met the test and gave this yard what it needed, and you did it without noise." He bows his head 1 inch, and the gesture surprises the ring. "Thank you," he says, "for the lesson and the care and the proof. Choose your measure." He tells the recruits not the loud one, but the true one that holds under heat. The colonel walks through the open fence line, and the circle opens for him. He stands before her and offers the sealed folder warm from his hand. "Open it here," he says, "so the message belongs to the yard and not to rumor." She slides the cord, lifts the flap, and draws a single page and a small badge. The crest matches the mark from the week, and the page is blunt and clear. Commendation for restraint and field leadership. Under pressure and selection for special instruction. The badge bears an older unit sign known for quiet work and few words. She does not raise the page, and she does not make a speech. She gives the colonel a small bow, and the head instructor, small nod, and folds the paper again. A small recruit stands near the post with damp eyes and unsteady hands. Her name is Sarah, and she has watched since the first step. "I want this calm," she says, "and I want this control, and I want to stop shaking." The woman opens her leather journal and writes a simple plan in neat lines. Breath on a count of 6. Stance on a count of 4. Water every drill rest between rounds. She tears the page and places it into Sarah's hand until it steadies. "Start here," she says, "and when you fall, stand again, and when you shake, count and keep moving." Sarah nods once, then twice, and the nod grows like a slow light behind her eyes. The yard breathes.